afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Wilmus, and I am a Public Program Coordinator at the National Archives. Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of the National Archives Expert Series, held in conjunction with our 75th anniversary. Today you'll hear Miriam's tantalizing and interactive tale of lost Jewish assets. Just very quickly before we begin, I'd like to call your attention to some other programs that are in celebration of our 75th anniversary. And in your program guide, they're just located on this side. We've got 2 more programs this week that should be great, and a bunch coming up in August as well. I'd also like to let you know about our comment cards that are in your program guides. As you leave, if you would just take a moment to fill them out, and we appreciate any and all feedback that you have. And you can just drop them off at the clear box on the table on the way out. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Miriam Kleiman. I think this will be a great talk, and I'm glad all of you could join us. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for sharing your lunch hour with me. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here today. Today I'm going to talk about one document. And I actually have copies of it on the table for you to take home copies as a souvenir afterwards if you're interested. What is so great about this one document? First, on a large scale, this document is the document that helped shatter Switzerland's wartime neutrality myth, changing how the world views how Switzerland and the Swiss banks acted during the Second World War. And on a much, much, much smaller scale, this little document is a document that changed my life. Now, today, I will address and hopefully answer 3 questions. 1, why and how did this story unfold? What was the timeline of events, the order of research discoveries, congressional hearings, lawsuits, official government reports, and eventual settlements with the Swiss banks? And why did this document and this issue emerge 50 years after the Holocaust? 2, how did this document and the National Archives become the center of this international investigation? And 3, what was the result? What happened? First, why and how did this story unfold? 50 years after the Holocaust, why then? For many years, people and survivors especially would not discuss the Holocaust. The human loss was so great that it seemed disrespectful to discuss the financial losses of the Holocaust. By the mid-90s, 1990s, there was convergence of factors that changed this. First, the Cold War had ended. Second, the Holocaust Museum had opened in 1993, and in that same year, the movie Schindler's List came out. People were talking about the Holocaust. Kids started asking their parents or grandparents about their wartime experiences. The average age in the mid-90s, the average age of a Holocaust survivor was in their 80s. And many of them began to share their stories for the first time. Personally, as an archives employee and a former researcher, I believe there was one other main reason, and that was the opening of the National Archives at College Park in 1995. For the first time, many different groups of World War II era records were in one building, as were the archivists who knew these records so well. How did this unfold? It all began with summer reading. Now, I'm going to show you, this is the cover of a novel, and it's not a particularly good novel. It's called The Swiss Account by Paul Erdmann, and it talks about the idea that maybe during World War II, the Swiss government and the Swiss bankers were in cahoots with the Nazis. It talks about US intelligence officials who were in Switzerland, a neutral country, during World War II, and some of the things that they witnessed. Again, it's not a great story. The reviews on Amazon are not terrific, but 2 people read it, and it had a very big influence on them. And I'm going to use this flow chart to illustrate how quickly this issue blew up and how it began and how quickly things changed.
What year was the book published?
The book was published, I think, in '93. And in summer 95, in summer 1995, two people read this book, among others. One was Rabbi Israel Singer of the World Jewish Congress, and one was Edgar Bronfman, the president of the World Jewish Congress. Now, Edgar Bronfman, multi-billionaire businessman. He had a history in the movies for a little bit, very wealthy, big businessman, had not been very religious. In the 90s, his father passed away, and as a tribute to his father's memory, he decided to become involved in some of the Jewish organizations that his father had been involved with. One of these was the World Jewish Congress. Now, like many Jewish organizations, the World Jewish Congress was very big after the war. By the 90s, not so big. And like other organizations, it was in search of a big issue. So, summer of 1995, two people at the World Jewish Congress, Rabbi Israel Singer, who was their main issues person, read the book and told Edgar Bronfman, who became president of the organization, you should read this. This is a fascinating idea. So they both read the book and began to do some research. What did Switzerland do during the war? This was a neutral country, a haven for refugees. They prided themselves on their wartime neutrality. But what if that wasn't the case? They spoke to some historians and began to look into the real role of Switzerland during the war. And by the end of summer 95, they wanted to speak to the Swiss bankers. Now, Bronfman, again, head of Seagram's, multi-billionaire businessman. When he asks for a meeting, he's granted a meeting. Now, so summer 95, they read the book. September 1995, Edgar Bronfman and Israel Singer go to Switzerland. Sorry about my handwriting. September 1995, Bronfman and Singer go to Switzerland to meet with the heads of the Swiss Bankers Association, a kind of grouping of representing the Swiss banks. So they met with them. That was September 14th, 1995. Now, this was an important meeting. Bronfman is not a young man. He's very distinguished, very important. And apparently, at the meeting, he was not even given a seat to sit down in. He was given an offer. The Swiss bankers, a representative said, we have looked into the records of the banks during World War II, and the number of dormant accounts, dormant meaning no activity, since World War II. There are 775 accounts that have not been touched. These may be Jewish accounts, they may not be. Of course, we don't have records because of bank secrecy. But the amount in these 775 accounts is $32 million. Take it or leave it. That's what we'll offer you. Now, Bronfman did not take it. He left, and he was mad. And he came back and said, I won't do an accent, but they didn't even offer me a chair. He was very upset and very offended. He also swore, as long as I take a breath, I will see that nobody profits from the ashes of the Holocaust. Now, Bronfman's Canadian. There was only so much he could do. Seagram's was headquartered in New York, but as a Canadian, there was only so much he could do. So he decided he would look elsewhere for an ally and chose a very unlikely ally. December 1995, December 7th, he went to Capitol Hill and met with Senator Alphonse D'Amato. Now, Edgar Bronfman, huge contributor to the Democratic Party. Why did he meet with Senator Alphonse D'Amato, huge Republican? Well, by December of 1995, forgive the pun, but Senator D'Amato was drowning in whitewater. He kept trying to nail the Clintons on whitewater. It wasn't working well. He was the new junior senator in New York, and he needed a big issue. And he was also chair of the Senate Banking Committee, which has jurisdiction over banking in the United States. And the World Jewish Congress, of course, knew that many of these banks by now had U.S. subsidiaries based in New York. So New York was the center. New York is also the state that has the most Holocaust survivors of any state. So later on, when people accused Senator D'Amato of doing this for political purposes, he would say, it was constituent service. Those are my constituents. Now, Bronfman and Singer met with D'Amato December 1995. Bronfman and Singer discussed the book, discussed some of their early research, and discussed how they were mistreated in Switzerland. And they asked D'Amato if he was interested in taking this on as an issue. Now, show of hands, has anyone worked on Capitol Hill or interned on Capitol Hill? Okay. Many or know people who were staffers on Capitol Hill? All right, a few other hands. Obviously, the senators, members of Congress are the figureheads, and they have incredible staffs that they rely on. I'm a bit biased. I'm married to a longtime congressional staffer, so I know how hard they work. D'Amato at the time had a congressional staffer named Greg Rickman. Now, Greg had started 7 years before working in the mailroom, as many people start out in the mailroom or answering phones on Capitol Hill. And Greg had worked his way up to legislative director, becoming a trusted advisor to D'Amato. Greg was brought in on this meeting, and D'Amato turned to him and said, what do you think? Is this an issue I should take on? Now, Greg thought about it. Greg happens to be Jewish, happens to have a master's in Jewish history, and happens to be the son-in-law of a Holocaust survivor. One more thing, Greg had just returned from a trip to the concentration camps with his father-in-law. Do you think Greg thought this was an issue to take on? Yes. So Greg took it on and started doing research, and D'Amato said, fine, take on the issue, the hearings, if we hold hearings, they're yours to run. So Greg took on the issue, began doing his own research, and trying to find out what did the US know at the time, what was Switzerland's role, what did US intelligence agencies know about what Switzerland did during the war. Now, Greg, under D'Amato's name, sent a letter to a number of different government agencies, and the letter was sent on February 23rd, 1996. So again, summer reading, trip to Switzerland, where he wasn't offered a chair, the meeting with D'Amato. February 96, Greg Rickman, under D'Amato's name, sends out letters to a number of different US government agencies, saying, basically, we're looking into this issue. Do you have any records? Do you know anything about this issue of lost Jewish accounts in Swiss banks during World War II? If you do, can you please make copies and send it to our office? It's 50 years after the Holocaust. The agencies, if any of them responded, they wrote back saying, we don't have anything, we can't help you, our records don't go back that far, we don't know anything about this. One agency was helpful, and that was the US National Archives. On March 13th, 1996, slightly under 3 weeks later, and again, I'm just writing these things to show you how quickly this happened. On March 13th, Assistant Archivist of the United States, Dr. Michael Kurtz, who just happened to have done his PhD dissertation on lost art, on looted art during the Holocaust, responded to Senator D'Amato. And he wrote, we regret that we cannot undertake the extensive research necessary to identify the exact documents that interest you. We will be pleased to assist your representatives in using our finding aids and to make pertinent records available in our College Park research room. So you can be head of the Senate Banking Committee, but you still have to come and do your own research at the National Archives. They're not going to do it for you. So he sent this to D'Amato's office saying, we may have things that relate to this. It's in a number of different locations. Basically send an intern, and we'll be happy to help them. It was March. There were no interns. Interns often come in the summer. D'Amato's office contacted the World Jewish Congress and said, can you send someone? Edgar Bronfman was not going to come and go through boxes. Israel Singer was their main policy person. Rabbi Israel Singer also was not going to come and go through boxes. They also had a PR person, Elon Steinberg. Again, not going to come and go through boxes. I happened to be, at that time, euphemistically, between jobs. Someone knew I was a researcher, I was unemployed, and called me and asked if I could do research at the archives. I had never done archival research. I'm not an attorney. I know nothing about finance. And apparently the World Jewish Congress had asked D'Amato's office, who in turn asked the archives, how long do you think this will take? You have a lot of information. How long will it take to go through what you've identified? And the archivist who dealt with this responded, it should take about 2 days. So someone called me and said, it's 2 days. Are you interested? And I said, I've never been to the National Archives. I've never done archival research. Listed all my caveats. They said, we need a warm body to go through boxes. Can you do it? I said, sure. I wasn't doing anything else. And on March 21st, I reported to Senator Alphonse D'Amato's office to meet with Greg Rickman. Now, Greg gave me a copy of the letter that he had sent to the archives, gave me a copy of the letter he'd received back with some information about where to start. And Greg said he had done some research and that he had learned that during World War II, the US was monitoring the flow of money from Nazi Germany to neutral countries because there was concern that once Germany had exhausted all of its reserves, that they might try looting gold and looting it through the neutral countries to get money to continue the war. And Greg said that he had heard the US followed this and that there was an Operation Safe Haven, which was the name of this investigation. So in the movie The Graduate, of course, Benjamin, I think, is told plastics, explore, follow plastics. And I was told explore Safe Haven. So I went to the archives on Friday, the next day, Friday, March 22nd. And I was given a cart with 13 boxes, just a place to start out. And I went through boxes, fine, didn't find anything. And again, Swiss numbered accounts, what was I going to find? But in terms of due diligence, the archives had said we might have something. D'Amato's office said, okay, we'll look into it. But there wasn't any expectation that anyone would find anything. Didn't find anything Friday. However, I returned to work, my new job, my 2-day job, on Monday, March 25th. I was going through boxes and I found my favorite document of all time. I found this document. Now, what is this document? The first thing that caught my eye was it says Safe Haven Report. That's what I was supposed to look for, Safe Haven. It was a US intelligence document from Bern. It's dated July 12, 1945. And it says basically, someone handed this list to a US intelligence officer in Switzerland. And it was someone in a bank saying, we don't know what to do. We have a lot of accounts that were opened before 1942. It's July 1945. It's after the war. These accounts have not been touched. And we don't know why that is. And the person had some ideas. He said that one, it might be people who were black marketeers who were trying to hide their money. Or it might be refugees who were leaving their home countries to ensure that funds would be safe from confiscation from their local authorities. Okay, fine, might be interesting. And I turn the page, and what do I find but lists of names and amounts, one after another. And the names were Isaac Feldstein, Baruch Halpern, Avram Isvaranu, Eric Lowenthal, Joseph Pincus, there were a few Rothschilds here, and it's Alexander Ogoza Gutman, et cetera, Eisinger, Mark Steen, Hyman. It's one Jewish name after another for 8 pages. And I didn't know what this was, and I had no idea what the amounts are. It's Swiss francs, French francs, Belgian francs, British sterling, Canadian dollars, 10 different currencies. I had no idea what this was. I called Greg Rickman. This was before cell phones. I called from a payphone in the lobby of the archives, and I said, I found a document that says Safe Haven, and it lists monetary amounts, and I'm not sure what this is, but I think it might be important. And Greg said, make a copy of it and come here immediately. And I did. I made a copy. I took the shuttle back from College Park to the main archives, then went to Capitol Hill, and I gave it to Greg. Now, has anyone here heard of Congressional Research Service? Okay. The Library of Congress has something called CRS, or Congressional Research Service. They have experts in so many different topics. Members of Congress can't possibly be experts on all the issues, and even with their extensive staffs, they're not experts on all the issues. However, a staffer can call the Library of Congress, can call Congressional Research Service, and ask for assistance. They can ask for a policy paper, they can ask for a translation. Greg Rickman called Congressional Research Service and said, this is an emergency. I have a document, this document which you will all be quite familiar with by the end of today's session. I have a document, it lists amounts, 10 different currencies. I need this compiled into US dollars, adjusted for interest and inflation, and I need you to get back to me with a figure ASAP. Again, if you're calling from the office of the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, pretty important office, you get a response rather quickly. I got a call at home, Greg Rickman screaming into the phone that he had heard back from Congressional Research Service. And this one list of accounts from one bank totaled over $20 million. The first hearing was held April 23rd, less than 1 month later. That's how quickly this blew up. Now, so that's how quickly this happened. And this report showed that information, historical proof of unclaimed assets in Switzerland, could indeed be found in US archival records. Now, this document ignited the issue, but there was a very unusual fire accelerant. Again, show of hands, I'm going to make this very interactive today. How many of you have done research at the archives? Oh, that's terrific, a number of you. And many of you, if you've copied anything classified, show of hands, anyone got a D-class slug? Okay, I'm going to talk about this very important little slug at the top. It's called a D-class slug at the top of a document. Any document that's been classified, in order for you to make a copy of it and walk out with it, you need something that just shows it's been declassified. So, and you get this, someone helps you fill it out, and then you tape it onto the copy machine, so every copy you make shows that it's declassified. Why am I going into this? Well, it's very interesting. Every D-class slug looks like this. And for those who can't see it, I'll have this up front later. It says declassified on the top, and then there's a line that says NND, and someone writes in a long thing. This one is 735027. Then there's a place for an archives official to signature saying, I checked this, it's fine, they can copy it. And there's the date it was copied, the date that you get the slug and make the copies. And for this document, it was 3/25/96. Who cares? Why is that an issue? That is an issue because you had Senator D'Amato at the first hearing theatrically waving this document and yelling, declassified 3 weeks ago at the National Archives. Now, anyone who's done research at the archives or worked at the archives knows this was declassified in 1973. That's the first two digits, NND 735027. So May 27th, 1973. This was not a new document. 99.9% of the documents that D'Amato waived in this and 6 other hearings were not newly declassified documents, but it made great TV. It made for great C-SPAN, and the press were fascinated. And it also says NARA date. That's something people understand. NND 735027, no. D-class date, and archivists would try to explain, no, you're misrepresenting us. This has been declassified for 25 years. This isn't a new document. But no matter how many times, obviously D'Amato knew the media impact of this. And if you look back on or see hearings or see the press repeatedly, newly declassified, declassified last week at the National Archives, declassified yesterday at the National Archives, and this made news. Now let me see where I am. Okay, I'm on my second point. How did this document and the National Archives become the center of an international investigation? Following the first congressional hearing on this issue, people started showing up in College Park. Research teams from law firms representing the Swiss government and the Swiss banks showed up at the archives. And the press soon followed, because again, senators were waving documents saying from the archives, newly declassified Swiss bank accounts. I mean, that's fascinating. So people started showing up. Now, to ensure equal access and information to all, archivist Greg Bradsher, who had known archivist Michael Kurtz for many years, archivist Greg Bradsher was assigned to work on this issue and to help people out. So he created a finding aid. For many of you who've done research or those who haven't, the National Archives has 9 billion pages of records, sometimes on issues of importance or records that many people are interested in. An archivist will create a finding aid, basically saying, these are places you might want to start your research. These are the boxes some things might be in. Archivist Greg Bradsher prepared a finding aid, and this was distributed at congressional hearings because the archives didn't want to be accused of cooperating with D'Amato's office but not with the banks, or because the archives is an open public archives. So he prepared, it's called Records Relating to Safe Haven Operations in Swiss Banks, and this was distributed at the congressional hearings, and it's about 10 pages. So Greg made that available. But the problem was, as any of you who've done archival research know, there is never an end to what you discover. And Greg Bradsher always had new discoveries. One day he took me aside. Needless to say, I was there for longer than 2 days. He took me aside and he said, Miriam, it turns out we have records of a different government agency. It was a wartime agency, so I wasn't aware of it. It's called the Office of Foreign Funds Control. It no longer exists, but we have about 500 Federal Record Center boxes, so big boxes of records that might be relevant to you. And he also said, these materials have not been processed. There's no finding aid. But if you want to go through them, you're welcome to. Those boxes compiled approximately 15 million pages of material. And I can be a good researcher, but that's way beyond my abilities. Suddenly, I had a team of researchers working with me, some people from the Holocaust Museum, some interns from D'Amato's office, and we sat around, and I have some pictures. We sat around a big table and went through box after box of documents. This went on more than a week, more than a month. This became a huge issue. D'Amato continued to hold hearings, and it was very clear early on that this would not be settled in a court of law, that this was going to be settled in a court of public opinion. And thus, the D'Amato's office gave documents to the press, the World Jewish Congress gave documents to the press, and we would find things and hand them over to the press immediately, and the story would run. Now, what did we find? We learned of the New York connection. Many of these banks have subsidiaries in New York now, but they also had subsidiaries during World War II, and they opened them during the war. They feared Nazi invasion, and many of the Swiss banks opened subsidiaries and transferred funds. The problem was the US government at the time did not like that because the banks talked about their neutrality and numbered accounts, and you can't do that in the United States. You have to turn over information to the government about the accounts, about the account owners, about how much is in them. And the United States government officials looking into this got very upset and began to investigate. We found their records from their investigations from the 1940s. And we learned that Credit Suisse in New York, for example, held a wartime account for Benito Mussolini. Needless to say, US officials were not happy with that. They grew concerned that the banks weren't following standard procedure. And they insisted that they provide information about the accounts, and when they didn't, again, the US launched an investigation. So a lot of our research was already done for us. As we tackled box after box, it was fascinating to read about Project Safe Haven, about Operation Safe Haven, and to see the myth of Swiss neutrality unravel. We learned that Switzerland had provided the Nazi regime with foreign exchange and war materials, and that they had continued this trade long after any real threat of invasion. In the words of a 1945 Treasury Department memo, as late as April 1945, the Swiss were in cahoots with the Germans. Now, I'm proud to say, by the summer of 1996, again, you see how quickly this developed. My first day was in March. By summer of 1996, this was a huge issue. And the German magazine Der Spiegel noted the importance of our College Park research efforts. And I quote, "The avalanche of slime from the archives is threatening to bring the entire Swiss banking center, today #1 in the world, into lasting disrepute." We were quite proud of that and continued our research. But it was amazing because, again, these were largely raw intelligence reports that had been declassified 25, 30, 35 years before. The project continued. It had now been about 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. It continued. In September of '96, I was called by a law firm and asked to come in and meet with one of their attorneys. I went in, I found myself sitting at a large table with lots of attorneys. The attorneys told me they were considering suing the Swiss banks on behalf of Holocaust survivors, and that they were considering doing these cases pro bono, for free. They asked, the managing partner of the firm asked me if I might be interested, from my background and from my knowledge, did I think they had a case? What did I think about this? I started speaking, and a while later, it was clear that I did think there was enough evidence to support this case. Again, I'm not a banker, I'm not an attorney, I don't have a PhD in history, but I'd been living at the National Archives for a number of months and going through these documents. One attorney who thought I was a little outspoken and only continued to view me as that as the months went by, he looked across the table, stared right at me and warned me. He said, it's one thing to accuse someone of tax evasion. It's another thing to accuse an industry of complicity with the Nazis. Do you know what you're saying? And do you really think that there's this kind of information to support this claim? I shared what I had learned after looking through box after box, month after month at the National Archives. Oddly enough, I was offered the job on the spot. My first day, I was given an office and told to write out what I had learned. A lawsuit was filed shortly after that. With congressional hearings and big lawsuits filed, class action lawsuits, this became a huge issue, and not only in the press. U.S.-Swiss relations were sorely tested. In October 1996, then President Clinton asked someone high up in his administration, Stuart Eizenstat, the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce, he asked him to investigate this issue and issue a formal report on Switzerland's wartime role. But it was unclear when this report would be issued. He was asked to do this in October '96, but it was unclear when the report would come out. Now, I've pointed to the D-class slug as an unusual accelerant in this case. The delay of the Eizenstat report, what became known as the Eizenstat report, was another. The press was anxious, anticipating whether or not the U.S. government would officially blast a longtime U.S. ally. Was Alphonse D'Amato right, or was this, hard to imagine for D'Amato, pre-election political posturing? Could these raw intelligence reports, again, these were not government conclusive reports, they were investigations. Could these raw intelligence reports be true, or were they just rumors? And was the worst of the accusations true? Did the gold purchased by the Swiss from the Nazis include so-called victim gold? Not just bars of gold from treasury, but gold looted from Jews and taken from dental gold, eyeglasses, and jewelry. That's what was called non-monetary or victim gold. Was that included in what the banks purchased from Nazi Germany? The report was delayed. Then we were told the report would be due out in March of 1997. So again, the report was assigned in October of '96. They started gathering information. March of '97, it's expected to be due out, but there were delays and it was held up again. Anxiety increased. Meanwhile, our research continued. By now, some of those summer interns had graduated, and I was fortunate enough to bring them on board at the law firm, and they were working for me in my new capacity. Again, it was early on, it was realized that this would not be settled in Congress, it would not be settled in a court of law, but in a court of public opinion. I was actually encouraged to speak to the press and to share my findings, and to hand them copies of documents, and even to say, hey, come with me to College Park. It was easy for reporters because I would hand them the materials, and I would also say, if you'd like the congressional perspective, call Greg Rickman. And if you'd like an archivist who knows a lot about this, call Greg Bradsher. So they had their sources for a story. And they had photos because they could come to the archives. Now, I really enjoyed speaking with the press. And years later, I now work in public affairs, so that's kind of fun. The report was delayed. Again, I'm only saying this because people wanted information. And so the press they came to cover the story, and the problem was the report didn't come out. We had a reporter, the USA Today wanted to do a story on the Eisenstadt report. The report was delayed. I said, come with me to the National Archives. And they did, the reporter did, and I found myself on the cover of USA Today, looking about age 15, with the quote, and I'll have this available afterwards. It has me speaking honestly about my research, saying, I had no idea what I was doing when I started, and no idea what I would find. It's shocking that they didn't settle right then. A Swiss magazine, the Swiss equivalent of Newsweek or Time, it's called Liebdo, or The News. A Swiss magazine came out the week that the Eisenstadt report was supposed to be issued. The problem was there was a delay, so they end up with me looking very fierce in front of the National Archives, talking about our research experience. And I, again, look very tough. A Cleveland paper did the same thing, me at the National Archives, so I became the story, which was kind of fun. But again, you know, the real suspense was what would the US government say. Now, and I just kept saying, come with me to College Park. It's a neat place. Visually, it's beautiful. Come look at the documents. I'll show you the boxes. It was also interesting because everyone was there. Attorneys representing the Swiss banks were there. Attorneys representing the Swiss government were there. My team representing the survivors were there. Lots of researchers were there. And at one point, they actually wondered, is there anyone in the College Park textual research room who's not investigating Swiss banks? Is anyone doing any other research? That's how many people there were. Now, what do you think the mood was like at College Park during this research? Any guesses? Hectic? Any other, maybe somber because of the importance of this issue? Stuart Eisenstadt later wrote a book, and he described the mood at College Park. He wrote, by the summer of 1996, over a dozen young interns were working with Kleiman and Rickman. They uncovered a treasure trove of materials that the World Jewish Congress and D'Amato used over the next several years to pique press interest and keep the Swiss on the defensive. The research at the National Archives had a frenetic Marx Brothers quality. The little-known archives facility in College Park, Maryland, was suddenly besieged by researchers from all the parties. Soon there was a battle not only in the halls of Congress and in the courts, but also among researchers. Greg Bradsher told me he often felt like a referee between competing researchers, each hoarding boxes of important documents and spying over one another's shoulders. The Swiss researchers called Rickman, this was D'Amato's aide, called Rickman Devil Boy. At the battle's height in 1997, right before the Eisenstadt report came out, there were almost 50 researchers working for the Swiss Bankers Association, for lawyers representing the Swiss and Holocaust victims, and for the State Department, all trying to elbow their way into a small area to examine documents. It was crazy at College Park. And we all knew who each other were. I could at any point out all the different researchers. One day, Greg Bradsher, the archivist, called Greg Rickman and I over and said, I want you to meet someone. And it was a lawyer representing one of the Swiss banks. Greg and I took the shuttle to the archives. This lawyer arrived in a limousine each morning. Greg and I, this is the summer, Greg and I were in shorts and t-shirts. This man was in a beautiful suit with cufflinks, had a degree in international finance, spoke 5 languages, and was being sent around the world to do research at different archival institutions. And that's when we realized, boy, are we out of our league with this. Now again, while the team of diplomats and experts were silent in advance of the report, I and my interns and Greg Rickman and Greg Bradsher were happy to share our views, and the reporters were interested. One morning, Good Morning America called. This was in March of 97, the beginning of March, April 97. And they asked if I would be willing to do an interview. Now, fine, I can talk to the Cleveland Jewish News or the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I'm from Cleveland, or even USA Today. Good Morning America. I know when a request needs to go to my boss. Again, I'm not an attorney, not a banker, and certainly did not want to eclipse any of the attorneys working very hard on this case to be interviewed. So I said, why don't you speak with the head partner at the firm? And they said, and the person who was setting this up said, I'm happy to speak with him, but I know you've been doing research. Could I speak with both of you? And I spoke with my boss, and he said, fine, and we set up the interview. Good Morning America came, set up. The reporter David Ensor was there for 2 hours, and I tried not to share my views because I tend, as you can guess, to be quite outspoken on this issue. But the attorney talked about legal precedents, talked about Nuremberg war crimes tribunals, talked about the lawsuit, talked about some of the plaintiffs, and I said one or two things. I was uncharacteristically quiet. They put away the lights, they cleared out the equipment, and I received my only reprimand that I received during my time at the law firm. This was before the story aired. The head partner took me aside and said, "You said two things in the interview that I would ask you never to repeat to the media again. One was I shared my view, my own, I'm sorry, I keep hitting that, my own personal thoughts about how the issue had developed, and the attorney thought that was a bit sensational, that I shouldn't have used those terms. The second thing was that I addressed the issue of victim gold. We were asked whether or not we thought some of the victim gold had been laundered through Switzerland. And again, this was before the official report came out. And I said yes, and I expounded upon that. And I was told, this hasn't been proven, you should not say anything like that. Okay, so I was appropriately humbled, and the report didn't air for a while. Then the report aired, and if you'd like to roll that.
One of the Swiss, Hitler's bankers. That is the subject of a new government report, U.S. government report, just out this morning. It's based on 14 million pages of U.S. documents, and it seeks to answer a couple of very disturbing questions. Number one, did the Swiss banks turn over Holocaust victims' assets in Swiss bank accounts to the Nazis? And two, did these venerable institutions actually launder money for the Third Reich? The report condemns the supposedly neutral Swiss for their wartime dealings, but it also criticizes the U.S. for failing to pursue the issue after the war. ABC's David Ensor reports.
But for the strict rules at a Swiss bank, Estelle Sapir might be a wealthy woman. As it is, she lives in one room in a boarding house in Queens, New York.
They have the money. They make so much money.
Her father, a rich merchant, died in a Nazi death camp. He told her through the barbed wire that he had a large account at the Credit Suisse Bank in Geneva.
These last words to me: try to survive. When you escape, don't worry for money. You have plenty of money in Switzerland.
But when Estelle Sapir got to the bank after the war, the man she spoke to refused to give her the money unless she produced a death certificate, something he knew she could not obtain.
He was so arrogant, so cold. I have the chills. When I talk to you now, I still see his face.
One question is this: do the Swiss still hold millions owed to the heirs of Holocaust victims? At the National Archives, researchers search among thousands of documents, including some seized from the defeated Nazis. Another question: were the Swiss acting as Hitler's bankers? Yes, says researcher Miriam Kleiman.
From Switzerland as a neutral country to Switzerland as the ATM for the Third Reich. That's really the transition we've gone through.
There is a paper trail showing some of the gold extracted from the teeth of murdered Jews ending up in Swiss banks.
33 tons of dental gold was taken from Auschwitz alone.
During the war, according to U.S. intelligence estimates, the Nazis deposited close to $400 million worth of gold in Swiss banks. But after the war, negotiators for the Allies settled for just $58 million. Swiss banks insist they have no records of names of depositors. But this document is a list obtained by U.S. intelligence from a Swiss banking official, a list of some accounts of Jews, and it includes the names and the amounts. Why did the Swiss banks get such a good deal from the Allies on the gold? Well, first of all, the Swiss never admitted to having so much of it. Second, Washington was distracted by the need to rebuild Europe and to face off against the new Soviet menace. For its part, the Swiss government recently launched an independent probe.
We are fully aware that nothing less than our reputation as an honorable country and reliable friend is at stake.
This is my father.
Today's report may increase pressure on Swiss banks, but it is all likely to be too late for Estelle Sapir.
My father, when he sees upstairs, he has to scream and cry. I leave.
For Good Morning America, I'm David Ensor in Washington.
And that U.S. government report being released today.
Needless to say, the two quotes that they used were the two I was reprimanded for, and they cut out my boss entirely. I was able to keep my job, which I was glad about. The Eisenstadt report finally came out in May of 1997. It accused Switzerland of being Nazi Germany's banker, and it confirmed that the Swiss National Bank, the equivalent of our Federal Reserve, had indeed purchased victim gold from the Holocaust. How I wish that on this issue and so many others, our research had been wrong. Now, hindsight is wonderful, but what did the US know at the time? It's easy for us to look back and say they should have known X, Y, and Z, but what did the US know at the time, and what did the Swiss bankers know? This is a part where I've distributed some secret Swiss bank books, and this is the part for audience participation. Katie will be going around with a microphone. Each bank book is numbered, so when I call the number, if you could read the highlighted portion. Okay, so hindsight is wonderful, but did the US know at the time that Germany might try to launder looted gold through neutral countries? The first bank book is a document, the State Department document. Who has bank book number 1?
U.S. government memo from January 16, 1945. On February 22, 1944, a gold declaration was issued by the U.S., UK, and USSR, declaring that those nations would not purchase gold from any country which had directly or indirectly circulated from an Axis source. It was circulated to the United Nations. Meanwhile, the question of gold policy had been raised directly with all of the European neutrals. Statements were made to the European neutrals that Germany had long since exhausted all of its pre-war gold resources and any possible accumulation from current production, and that by necessity any gold offered by Germany must be presumed to be looted. The neutrals, therefore, were requested to indicate that they would purchase no gold directly or indirectly from any Axis sources.
Thank you. So that's 1944-45. The countries were warned. The neutrals had all been warned that any gold coming from Germany should be presumed to be looted, and they were warned not to take any gold from Germany. Okay, so the U.S. knew, the U.S. was monitoring this, but did the banks have any way of knowing? This excerpt references Maurice Golay, who was the chief general manager of the Swiss Bank Corporation, one of Switzerland's largest banks, and he visited a bank in France. And this is very early on in the Nazi rise to power. Who has bank book number 2? Yes.
Mr. Golay took me down to the receiving teller's window to show me what was going on in the way of export of French capital. There was a line of about 60 people waiting with cash, jewelry, old pictures, securities, and other valuables. It would appear this is going on all along, and the Swiss bank has reached the point where they do not know how they can continue to handle French customers, owing to the physical shortage of space for safe custody. Whereas before it was the big fellows who ran across the frontier, today it is the small people who export their capital.
Thank you. That was the bank's concern, that they were running out of room because people were opening up safe deposit boxes and they were fleeing, and that they knew these were not the big people, the big donors, but people fleeing with anything they had and trying to secure it. So the bankers knew. Now, Swiss officials continue to stress their wartime official neutrality, drawing a line between economic neutrality and political and military neutrality. But what we found at the archives proved otherwise, and proved that U.S. officials at the highest levels knew that the Swiss were providing military assistance to the Nazi regime. Who has bank book number 3?
Memorandum for the Secretary of War dated January 15, 1945. Down to the fall of 1944, the Swiss produced and exported to Germany large quantities of ammunition, aircraft parts, radio equipment, and other military supplies, as well as machine tools, precision instruments, locomotives, and industrial equipment. They also furnished to Germany electric power, and their railroads carried a heavy traffic for the Germans between Germany and Italy. These activities were of substantial assistance to the Germans in waging war. Signed, Robert P. Patterson, Undersecretary of War.
And there's one more. There's a number.
Mr. Patterson expressed a willingness to turn the bombers loose and make life unpleasant for the Swiss generally.
Thank you. So you have the U.S. Undersecretary of War talking about how much aid the Swiss were giving military assistance to the Nazi regime, and how the U.S. Undersecretary of War at one point, even jokingly or otherwise, thought about bombing Switzerland. Now, this is a part for all of you to participate, and I want whoever can to vote. It's a game. I'm going to introduce a topic, and someone's going to read a passage from a document, and a document, story, or article. And I want you to vote afterwards. And this is easy. It's only two choices. Is this document from 1945, or is this document from referring to something in 1996? You don't have no years in between, 1945, right after the war, or 1996, our follow-up investigation. Who has, this is a quote from a congressional hearing on the issue of Swiss wartime neutrality. Who has Bank Book number 4?
The Germans maneuvered themselves back into a position where they could utilize their assets in Switzerland to support their war effort, could acquire desperately needed foreign exchange by the sale of looted gold, and could conceal economic reserves for another war. These moves were made possible by the willingness of Swiss government and banking officials in violation of their agreement with the Allied powers to make a secret deal with the Nazis.
Okay, thank you. All right, congressional investigation led by a senator. Show of hands, is this D'Amato 1996 or is this 1945? Who votes for 1945? Okay, who votes for 1996? If you could lift the tab.
Harley M. Kilgore, Chairman, Subcommittee of War Mobilization.
And
1945.
Thank you. So this was West Virginia Senator Harley Kilgore, who chaired the Senate Military Affairs Committee in 1945. This committee, the so-called Kilgore Committee, found in 1945 that the Swiss banks had purchased looted gold from Germany. Swiss Bank Book number 5 is a quote from the Swiss press lambasting an aggressive and obnoxious American senator.
Honourable Senator, getting to be known in Switzerland. He's not one of our friends. Already, a year ago, he made rather serious accusations against our country in press. This new attack is but one episode in fight directed by greatest power in the world against a country of 4 million inhabitants. This is all the more incomprehensible, as on the whole, the matter is not of considerable importance.
All right, 1945. 3 hands. 1996. Majority says 96, if you could read.
Dated November 20th, 1945.
Thank you. That's slamming Senator Kilgore. Was there less anger? The Swiss were mad, and thank you all for helping me out with the readings, and we have one left. The Swiss were mad. The press was angry, the government was angry, the bankers were angry. During that investigation, and of course in the years following, anytime that this came up, and especially angry at D'Amato. Now, one would like to think there was less anger this time around, that it's not, right a few years after a war, right after a war. Swiss Bank Book number 6 is a document. It is not from the National Archives. It was faxed to Senator D'Amato's office in Washington from David Vogelsanger, a Swiss diplomat. He was the #2 diplomat at the Swiss embassy. He did not like this investigation. He did not like D'Amato, and this was faxed right after D'Amato lost the election. And when Vogelsanger found out that his new assignment would be Sofia, Bulgaria.
Dear ex-Senator D'Amato, I should like to congratulate you upon your miserably failed re-election to the United States Senate. As a Swiss citizen, I am proud of the New Yorkers who have sent you where you belong, on the dung heap of cheap and corrupted politics. Your campaign of lies against my country has not saved your political career from oblivion as planned. I savor the irony that your hack was finally broken by your allies in the anti-Swiss smear campaign, the Clintons and the Holocaust exploiters. Give my regards also to Greg Rickman, the little filth scraper who provided you with the pseudo-historical dirt to throw at us. As for the damage you have undoubtedly done to the over 200-year-old relations between the two oldest democracies in the world, better people than you will work hard to repair it and succeed. Sincerely, David Vogelsanger, formerly stationed in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. So was there less anger this time around? No. And it's a bit cliche to say this here in the National Archives, but what is past is prologue. 50 years later, there were similar hearings, investigations, Swiss press reports, and even similar levels of absolute fury that the U.S. would even dare to investigate this. Now, 3, what happened? What was the end result? There were more congressional hearings, lawsuits, and news stories, all based on documents from College Park, all based on documents from the National Archives. In August 1998, the lawsuits against Switzerland's largest banks settled for $1.25 billion. Sadly, after subtracting fees to attorneys and accountants, the attorney I worked for took it on pro bono, a number of others didn't. The individual accounts for plaintiffs was not large. However, this led to a whole wave of similar lawsuits against French banks, German banks, Austrian banks, lawsuits involving looted gold during the Holocaust, involving Holocaust insurance policies that were never paid, and lawsuits against German companies with U.S. subsidiaries or U.S. companies with wartime German subsidiaries who used and profited from forced and slave labor. Stuart Eisenstadt titled his book Imperfect Justice because there can be no real justice from the Holocaust, for the enormity of the losses from the Holocaust. However, the historical record, the Swiss historical record, and the Swiss neutrality myth were changed and shattered forever. I should also add that I mentioned Greg Bradsher, the archivist, continued to update his finding aid as records were discovered. The most recent version of that finding aid is 1,163 pages, and it's still being updated. This was a very short, actually not that short, intro to a big and complicated issue, and it all started with your souvenir today, a single document declassified in 1973. Thank you all for coming and sharing your lunch hour with me. And even though I ran over time, we will have some time for questions. I think the first one is back there.
Did the woman disappear in the ABC Good Morning America survive and see any return on her father's deposits at the Swiss bank?
Okay, that is the most painful question for me. And I used to speak a lot about this issue because when I started, it was such a clear case of good versus evil. It's hard to find something that clear cut. Unfortunately, the sides that changed over the years with some unscrupulous attorneys. Estelle Sapir kind of became the poster child for these issues, and her case settled separately, and she did receive a large amount of money. Unfortunately, her attorney stole from her. He has since been disbarred in New York and New Jersey. A number of the attorneys involved on the so-called good side, there were a number of financial improprieties. One of the people with the World Jewish Congress took some of the funds that were supposed to go to survivors and embezzled them in a secret Swiss bank account. So it's not as clear as it used to be. The only thing that's clear, of course, is the historical record and the documents. Estelle Sapir, unfortunately, has passed away. I don't know how much of the money she saw and how much was taken from her. Whoever.
The countries you mentioned didn't include countries like Hungary or Romania or Eastern European countries, which we also know were very much trying to destroy the Jewish communities, and I would assume also took assets. Has anything happened with those countries?
The question was about other countries that were part of the Third Reich. There have been investigations, and numerous countries launched their own investigations. In fact, many of them appointed commissions and historical commissions. A lot of that is available on the web. If you email me, I have cards. I'm happy to send you links to a number of the government reports, because needless to say, a number of countries began to examine their own histories. After the Eisenstadt report came out criticizing Switzerland, there was a follow-up criticizing the other neutrals. And then there were follow-up subsequent conferences and reports where other countries at the time began to examine their own wartime records. How accurate the reports are, it's not always clear. But I can certainly send you links to those.
It was worth mentioning that the Swiss handed over 64,000 Jews to the Germans who tried to get refuge, and they put the Jews who managed in terrible camps. My parents were in there, and my parents and I myself have been in French concentration camps, and my parents said their treatment in these camps in Switzerland were just as bad as the French camps, except they didn't send them to Auschwitz. The other thing is, I have an answer. I am born in Belgium, and we escaped immediately when the war started into France. My father has tried to get compensation. The Germans said the Belgians took everything. The Belgians took the Germans. He died in '72. My mother died in '67, and they never got anything because Jews in Belgium didn't trust banks ever since they came from Eastern Europe. My mother lived there since 1903, and they kept things in the safes. The Belgians raided those safes and never compensated. They opened the commission. I even wrote to that commission. They were willing to give me $1,500 because they said I didn't have any receipts.
And unfortunately, that was the norm. They asked for
yes.
death certificates, they asked for receipts, and if people escaped with their lives, they were lucky, let alone bringing their entire financial accounting with them. Thank you for sharing your story with us. And I'm sorry that you went through that and that there was even the smallest, meager compensation is so offensive. And unfortunately, that's the norm rather than the exception. Switzerland, that was one of the things we found out. This whole neutrality myth of Switzerland as a safe haven for refugees, it was the Swiss government, not the German government, not the Nazis. You may have seen that passports of Jews during World War II have a bright red J stamp for Jude. That was not a Nazi idea, that was a Swiss idea. The Swiss government asked the Nazis to stamp the Jewish passports so that they could recognize fleeing Jews and separate them at the border, so that they wouldn't even enter the country. That way, vacationing Nazis could come in and spend their money in Switzerland, but they could turn away fleeing refugees. That was just one of the things we learned during the investigation.
Now, with regard to the Kilgore Committee and the Kilgore hearings, did anything result from those taking place at the time they did? Why did it take so long for anyone to find them when they came along 50 years later? And how were they finally discovered? One would have thought that there would have been enough institutional memory to remember, well, we already had hearings on this, but apparently nobody thought of that.
Those are good questions. The Kilgore Committee led to an accord called the Washington Accords, where the countries, Switzerland was forced to pay a certain amount of money, but it was a small amount, and they lied about the amount that they had taken in during the war. One of the things we found, Greg Bradshaw found, was their briefing book, the US government briefing book for this diplomatic conference. And why did it take so long? Because suddenly Germany was the ally and Russia was the enemy. And that's why it took until after the Cold War for this to come up again. In terms of institutional memory, the volume of records received from World War II is huge, the amount of US government records. And like most of the treasures at the archives, people don't know that they're there. Only a small amount of the 9 billion have been gone through or processed, which is why, I love the fact that I could come in and find something that had been there for years that no one had discovered before, and there are so many other stories at the archives waiting to be found.
I would just like to add that the Swiss banks at the time of your research were doing their own research, were disposing, shredding, and burning documents. One employee of a Swiss bank came forward with this story. He was, of course, let go. He now lives in Israel. I think his wife divorced him and he now lives in Israel. But the other thing is my mother's grandparents also had numbered account and she didn't know the number. That was so not only not death certificate, but not number.
And they claimed they didn't have any records.
Correct.
And it was all numbered, which is why this one document was so important. You mentioned that a bank employee of the Union Bank of Switzerland, UBS, found that they were destroying documents, and he saved some of the documents, which were account ledgers, wartime account ledgers, and turned them over to officials. His name was Christoph Miley, and he faced death threats. He was actually granted, there was a congressional hearing by D'Amato on this issue, and he became the first Swiss citizen to be ever granted political asylum in the United States. He moved to California, where a group of Holocaust survivors called the 1937 Group paid for his college education. I think we have time for one more question. Afterwards, I will stay here a while. I know I've run out of time, but I'm happy to stay and take any additional questions.
To current date, are there any accounts left with Swiss banks that you know about or that the government knows about that have had no activity since the end of World War II?
Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. One of the things the attorney I worked for wanted more than anything else was a full accounting, and they wanted the Swiss banks to turn over their records. But you can't force another country to do that. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were numerous accounts.
With just the gesture of goodwill, have any Swiss banks come forward to and actually cooperate with the investigation?
Some banks got in trouble for doing that. They did decide to do their own research and post lists of accounts, and they published a list in the New York Times, a full page, which was $75,000 at the time, which was more than they ended up, many of the banks, giving. And it was showing how forthcoming they were and how these were dormant accounts, and they wanted to come clean and list them. And they were humiliated. No one had done research. A number of the names on the list were Nazis, leading Nazis, Hitler's, one of Hitler's bankers, one of Goring's jewelers, a photographer for the Nazi regime, and a number of the prominent names were huge Nazis who had opened Swiss bank accounts and either fled after the war or died or were sentenced, and no one claimed them. After that, the banks put something online, but you had to have the correct spelling of the last name, and many names have changed. And I was never sure what was coming out of the banks to begin with, and then they stopped being even that level of being forthcoming. They basically settled to make the issue go away. Okay, one last question.
There was something in the paper recently that the government of Switzerland, even if the banks wanted to give out information, they would prevent them from doing it.
The man said that even if the banks wanted to, the government was telling them not to, and that doesn't surprise me. The government was not forthcoming with this at all, and they were actually angry, and a number of government officials said some really stupid things. They really couldn't understand why this was an issue. And one of the biggest Swiss bankers said, I don't understand, the Jews at Auschwitz were barefoot. They didn't have bank accounts. Another leading banker referred to the amount as peanuts. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And these were just the people who had accounts, the enormity of losses. This was just shedding a light on one small issue. And even this listing of accounts says that these were only big accounts, that the person isn't going to even list the accounts under 10,000 Swiss francs. So the enormity was so huge. And the Swiss, can you imagine writing the letter that you so wonderfully read? Being a diplomat and sending that letter with your signature to a political office? The arrogance was shocking. So again, thank you for sharing your lunch hour with me, and I will stay here and be happy to answer questions. And document, so please feel free. Oh, thank you for reading too. Thank you.
No, this is for a group of older people.
Oh, okay.
Older, 50s and up.
When do you meet?
When we have a speaker or a special event.
Well, I will certainly see. Thank
so
you.
why don't you just think it over
Okay.
and see what your schedule
I used
is.
to do a
unless
lot
you-
of this before so many of the people,
Right.
before the issue got more morally complicated.
Right. Do you want me to send you some